Elizabeth Clare Prophet, noted author, lecturer, and educator, interviews the special people who provide the missing dimension to the news that affects you. Courageous men and women from all over the world who have taken a stand for truth and justice and become spokesmen for the flame of freedom. Listen now as Elizabeth Clare Prophet and her guest discuss critical issues of the day.
Welcome to Summit University Forum, where the flame of freedom speaks. I'm Elizabeth Clare Prophet. The race for space may soon determine who will be the dominant power on this planet. But the once vaunted U.S. space program is now in disarray, and the Soviet Union is achieving some remarkable successes. We have a report on this compiled from ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and High Frontier.
The space shuttle offers us an opportunity to step off the nuclear treadmill and out into the new high frontier of space. Commander John Young.
The space shuttle will be able to do in 5 to 10 years what it would have taken us 20 to 30 years to do otherwise. We couldn't do it if we didn't have the space shuttle and that payload capability. It will immeasurably improve the defensive capability of the country.
If we utilize the extraordinary capabilities of the space shuttle to deploy the system known as High Frontier, America, for the first time, will be able to defend herself against a Soviet missile attack.
Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Engines beginning throttling down now. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
The prime unmanned backup now used for putting big U.S. military payloads into space since the Challenger disaster today exploded on takeoff. It was the second straight failure in 8 months of a launch of an unmanned Titan 34D rocket from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And CBS News was told tonight that, in effect, the United States now has no system for putting big, sophisticated military reconnaissance satellites into orbit.
Good evening. At Cape Canaveral tonight, an unmanned Delta rocket exploded just a minute after liftoff. It was the second explosion of a U.S. spacecraft since the Challenger disaster last January. Last month, an Air Force Titan rocket exploded. Jay Barbary is at Cape Canaveral and watched as the Delta rocket broke up in flames.
NASA's most reliable rocket, an unmanned Delta, blew up shortly after what appeared to be a successful liftoff. The slender rocket climbed into the sky with a $57 million weather satellite in its nose. It flew as it should for 1 minute, and its first set of solid rocket boosters fell away as scheduled. Then it happened. The rocket appeared to swing out of control, and debris streamed from the nose of the Delta. The rocket flipped over, breaking up into a fireball.
The launch had been delayed 14 minutes because of stormy skies accompanied by lightning. But NASA weather experts gave a green light.
Main engine sequence start, ignition.
The 137-foot rocket roared off the pad with the backdrop of gray clouds. On board the Atlas Centaur was an $83 million Navy communications satellite called the FleetSat-Com. Lightning is reported to have struck the launch pad 35 seconds after liftoff. The rocket disappeared into the dark clouds, and at 51 seconds, all communications went dead. The range safety officer then destroyed the vehicle.
The one impetus that we have not been talking about, the one force that hasn't come into this conversation yet, is our competition with the Soviet Union. Where do we stand in that competition, and what effect is that going to have on the future?
Ted, I think we're dangerously close to being in a perilous situation there, because last year, for instance, in 1985, I believe the Soviets had 97 total launches. That's of all kinds. At the same time, we had 22.
Pentagon sources say the Soviets are ready to begin manned testing of 2 reusable space planes. That closes the only major gap remaining between the Soviet space program and NASA's. CNN's John Holloman has more.
Defense Department sources say the Soviet space plane, which has successfully been launched and recovered from orbit 4 times, will be ready for full-scale manned testing by the end of the decade. These same officials say it will be used to defend the Soviet space station or to attack satellites. Some non-military analysts aren't so sure.
I think that they do have several more steps to go through before they'll have a functional space plane. And whether they plan to use that as a ferry craft for taking crews back and forth to space stations, or if they plan to outfit it for military reconnaissance roles, I think is really up in the air.
In addition to the two-person space plane, the Soviets are developing a large shuttle similar to the U.S. version. The Pentagon expects a manned flight by next year, but Smith says it probably won't be operational till 1990. Even though there's disagreement about specifics, there is a general sense among U.S. observers this country is losing the space race to the Soviets.
The Soviets have launched 7 space stations since 1971. They have kept Salyut 6 continually manned by alternating crews of cosmonauts that remain aloft in excess of 200 days at a time. An entire city, Startown, exists solely for the training of their strategic rocket forces personnel. The Soviets launched 5 times as many rockets and placed 10 times as much equipment into space as we did. Their commitment is clear, constant, and determined.
But right now, they do have a tremendous lead over the U.S. in this one area of space activities, which is manned Earth orbital operations.
In terms of permanent habitation, permanent capability on orbit, I guess we're at least 8 years behind.
They're working on much larger boosters. They're working on a reusable vehicle. And as best we can tell, they have sort of indicated that they are, in fact, on their way to Mars.
Conrad says it's up to the president to get America's act together in space, but it's not going to be easy. The U.S. space program is beset with problems, from the Challenger disaster a year ago to last month's Atlas rocket failure. Some space agency supporters in Congress say lack of action by the administration has weakened support for NASA almost to the breaking point.
Tonight, my guest is Thomas Krebs, a retired Air Force officer and formerly the Pentagon's chief analyst on space warfare capabilities. During his distinguished career with the Air Force, Mr. Krebs worked on the Space Shuttle and the B-1 bomber programs. He is the author of TZAR Wars, the challenge posed to the free world by the Soviet commitment to the military control of space. TZAR Wars is an expanded version of a special briefing Mr. Krebs gave to President Reagan on August 8, 1983, on the progress of the Soviet space-based missile defense. Thomas Krebs, welcome to Summit University Forum.
Thank you.
I notice you have a copy of TZAR Wars, what seems to be one of the few existing copies.
That's my only copy.
I know because I've been reading Xeroxes of it. It's a very intriguing book, and the way you made your way through much distress and duress to be able to give the president a 12-minute briefing on Soviet space capability has truly touched my heart. And I know it's going to touch the hearts of the people here. You worked very long and hard on an assignment with, I believe, Ernie Herrera.
That's right.
And the two of you researched for over a year and a half just what the Soviets were doing in space. And apparently, we had dropped our observations of the Soviets when we succeeded on the moon, and they did not. We had stopped watching them.
Not totally.
Not totally.
In a large measure, that's correct.
So here we find that TZAR Wars is the Soviet version of our SDI, our Star Wars, that it's in progress and well on its way.
I believe it is, yes.
Now the clips we just saw are showing us, number one, that we've had 8 failures in 2 years in space. Very alarming, depressing, causing a shakedown at NASA. What do you think about those failures, and what does that do to our capability?
Well, I think there's probably some misconceptions about that. As I go around the country talking to people, some of them ask me about that and imply that perhaps it's sabotage on the part of the Soviets. Of course, I don't know. It could be, but I very, very much doubt it. Those rockets, those systems are very complex, and we've had an amazingly good record of launches over the years. We've had a string of failures, and that's true. But our record in space is better than the Soviets, for example. They've had more losses as a percentage. I think the real failure is not so much a technical failure in this sense as it is probably some quality control, some systems engineering type failures. But the more important failure probably would be a failure of vision, which I think unfortunately we suffer from in the U.S. space program. So I wouldn't focus so much on a few explosions. That's to be expected in such a large endeavor.
Well, that word vision takes us to your Star Wars and to your briefing of President Reagan in 1983. You brought to him a vision, and to a lot of people, both in the military and in the civilian sector, of just what the Soviets were doing. We understand from your book that there was a lot of opposition to your presenting that program, and it almost fell through at the last minute, but for the intercession of Weinberger.
That's right.
So you did get to make your presentation, and you brought a report that was a shocking report. And since that time, the Soviets have even gone farther in space.
That's right.
Even this news clip is telling us that the Soviets have some catching up to do. Let's talk about what the Soviets are doing and what catching up we have to do.
All right. The Soviets are doing a lot of things in space. I would say most people who are interested in space endeavors would wish we had the Soviet program and they had our program, unfortunately. It's not that they're so smart. It's that they do have a vision. They know what they want to do in space, and they allocate the resources to it. And if they have a problem, they pick themselves up and start again. They don't give up. We often in the United States have the feeling we have to do things perfectly. And we spend an awful lot of money and an awful lot of time to do things perfectly. And if they don't turn out perfectly, we're very disappointed and even sometimes feel like we should quit. The Soviets rarely do things perfectly in space. They fail in grandiose manners. They fail frequently. But because of an awful lot of persistence, they are succeeding better than we are. And it has to do with what their vision is for space. Now, way back in the mid-60s, the Soviets set a space doctrine. And if you don't mind, I'll just take a moment and look in here to refer to my what it was. Basically, their space doctrine was to gain preeminence in space in order to achieve victory in war. Now, the United States did not have a space doctrine until about 18 years after that. There was a document that floated around the Pentagon as to, what should be our policy with respect to space and the militarization of space. The Pentagon did not agree on what that policy would be for 18 years after the Soviets had agreed. And theirs, as I said, was to essentially dominate space because they thought it was essential to achievement of victory in warfare. Now, that's a very simple idea, but if you know where it is you want to go, you have a much better chance of getting there than if you don't know. And the Soviets have known for a long time, and they've been expending resources at an increasing rate, a very high increasing rate. As a matter of fact, much higher than the resources have been going up on the rest of their defense program, say for the last 5 years, much higher. But for a long time, since the mid-60s, they've been putting these resources in to gain that objective. I don't believe they've reached that objective yet, but they're far along the path. We, however, have not had an objective in space. We do scientific experiments. We build transportation systems. We went to the moon. The military uses a lot of satellites for support things like navigation beacons and communications and so on, but we don't have a military objective in space. Now, I'm not so sure that in a perfect world anyone should have a military objective in space. But in the current world, it's kind of a bad situation when the Soviets do have a military objective in space and we don't.
You have talked about not only the military consequences of the Soviet dominance of space, but also the economic. Now, just who gets there first and dominates space seems to be what is going to determine, in your opinion, the future course of the history of this Earth.
Well, obviously we're both there now, and there's a lot of commercial activities occurring on our side. It's hard to say that there's commercial activities occurring on their side because it's one big monolith. I would say that if the Soviets achieve their goal of military domination of space, it's very likely they will achieve the goal of military domination of the Earth. And if they achieve that, they'll have economic domination of the world also. So, in my book, in TZAR Wars, I put together two chapters. One was called The Bleak Future, and one was called The Bright Future. And at the end, I give a little poem by Robert Frost. It's called, now again, I'll just refer to this because I never remember the exact name. It's The Road Not Taken. And in that poem, it basically says that there's a fork in the road and you can choose which way you go. And we can either have the bleak future or the bright future. In the bleak future, the Soviets go about trying to achieve their objective in space, and the United States responds sometimes they don't respond. We argue a lot. We never decide what our objectives are. And in that case, I think economically it would be a disaster. Politically it would be a disaster. Spiritually it would be a disaster. In fact, I guess it would be a big disaster. In the bright future, at least in my book, the Soviets do the exact same things. But in this case, the United States does some rather intelligent things in response. Plus, we have our own initiatives, and we do intelligent things there. In that case, the world is better off, the Western world, and the Soviets are better off. It's quite an involved story, but it all fits together. And the key is what we do in space. We know what the Soviets are going to do in space, at least in broad general outlines.
We know that the Soviets are moving ahead on all fronts in space. We know they violated the ABM Treaty. We know that they are capable right now of launching a first strike. And we know that we do not have any defense whatsoever against that first strike, and that we cannot meet it with offensive forces.
Defensive forces, right. We have no defensive forces.
Right. But the point is, unless we have specific defenses to tackle that which is coming over the pole, we can't use what we are intending to use to launch a second strike to deal with that which is coming. We don't have the strategic defense necessary to meet that which is coming. And what I'd like you to tell us about, first of all, beginning at the beginning, give us the best portion of the briefing you gave to the President that is now unclassified, and take us through the step-by-step awareness of what the Soviets have done to outstrip us in space capabilities.
Okay. The briefing wasn't unclassified. Some of the information in the briefing was unclassified, so I'll try and tell you about that. Let me hit the highlights. We saw earlier in the film clip that the Soviets are building a space shuttle. Well, we've built a space shuttle. But if you were to look at the National Museum of Space in Washington, D.C., you'd see 5, 6, or 7 different types of space shuttles. Those were the different types that came about during the concept phase, where they were thinking, what would a space shuttle look like? And I was involved in that, and it came in every shape and form. Finally, we settled on a design. Now the Soviets are building one. It looks almost identical to ours. And I think you could infer that it wasn't accidentally made identical to ours. You know, they essentially had to copy our plans.
Since we gave our plans to anyone who wanted them, they no doubt picked them up.
That's right, the plans are unclassified. There was only one little part of the main engine that was classified. All the rest was unclassified. So they saved themselves an awful lot of money by picking up on that design. As a matter of fact, they improved on it. Now this is where it helps to have a vision or a goal. We could have made the space shuttle so that it would put up an awful lot more weight than it does. Currently, if we didn't have these problems in the last year or so, it would have put up about 65,000 pounds into low Earth orbit. Now what the Soviets did was to take the engines off the orbiter. The orbiter is that thing that looks like an airplane, goes up into space, and they put them under the external tank, that real big fat thing that's full of hydrogen and oxygen. Now, because they did that, they made a modification to our design. They can still fly up into space with the orbiter attached and put up maybe 65,000 pounds, or they can take the orbiter off and put a big payload on top of that external tank, because remember, the engines are now underneath the external tank. They're not on the orbiter. And that payload can weigh as much as the orbiter plus its payload, or somewhere between, and no one's certain yet, somewhere between, say, 220 to 330,000 pounds. Now that's a tremendous improvement over the space shuttle that they got almost for free. Okay. Now, so they've got they will have a space shuttle flying. They haven't flown one yet. And they did make the first flight of that big booster without the orbiter attached. Now that's something the United States doesn't have, sorely needs for a number of purposes, but has no firm plans to make, although there are some studies going on. So we told the President about those two things, that they were coming up. And we also told him about the space plane. Now there have been concepts about space planes for the United States for many, many years, probably back to the time near when I went into the Air Force in 1963, well over 20 years ago. But we don't have a space plane. We never had a space plane, and I don't know if we ever will have one. There's no firm plans for that, although a lot of studies. The Soviets have flight tested a number of times a scale model of a space plane. And when I say a scale model, I don't mean something that's this big. It's pretty big. You know, it's 8 or 9 feet long, and it's 10 or 12 feet wide. And it's gone up into space, and it's come down again. We have put up a space station. If you remember the Skylab space station, was up in about 1975. In fact, there was a joint U.S.-Soviet mission at that time. The Apollo, no, it wasn't the Apollo, it was the, anyway, it was a joint program with the Soviets back in 75. That was our only space station, and sometime later it deorbited and came into the atmosphere. The Soviets to date have put up 8 space stations. The current space station, called the Mir, which also stands for peace, among other things, is up, and that went up in 1986. And it's expandable. In other words, it can get larger and larger. They can add 6 large segments to it. In fact, even perhaps more if some of those segments have attach points added onto them.
I think you said it could be 100 feet long.
Yes.
Has that increased since you wrote that?
Yes. This during that briefing, I told the President what they had and what we thought they were going to make in 2 stages. And they're into these first of those additions right now with the Mir space station. Now the Mir space station, it's a little uncertain how many people will fit aboard, but maybe say 8 to 12 eventually. And that would be about the size, if maybe a little larger, than the space station the United States is planning to put into space by about the mid-90s. Now, we also think that by about the mid-90s, and we told the President this, that the Soviets will have gone a further step and have a space station that's not 100 feet long, but will hold 100 cosmonauts, probably weigh 1 million pounds. Now that is space in a big way. 100 permanent, a manned space station that's permanently manned with 100 cosmonauts, well trained. You saw in the film strip, Star City. That's where they train those cosmonauts. In our program, we have cosmonauts that are quitting because they can't get into space. And the Soviet Union built a city to train the cosmonauts that are going and will be going into space.
Now, you speculated in your book as to what those 100 cosmonauts might be doing in a military capacity, both in a pre-war situation and in a war.
Yes, and it is just my speculation. But then again, that was what my job was to speculate on what the Soviet space program was and what it would be doing in the future. Out at Omaha, if you were to go out to the SAC headquarters, you would see they'd have a plane called the Looking Glass. And what that is an alternate command post for all of our nuclear forces. It holds about 20 people, including a 3- or 4-star general. And if need be in a nuclear war and the ground command posts were destroyed, this plane would be able to launch our bombers, our submarine missiles, our silo-based missiles, and so on. It only takes 20 people to do that. 20 well-trained people. We're talking about 100 well-trained people. So it could be used as an alternate command post for nuclear forces. It could also be used as an intelligence fusion center. Now, who knows what that is? What that is a place where intelligence or information on a lot of different things comes in and is fused together into some kind of a meaningful whole. Now, spacecraft are used today and have been for many years to gather intelligence. Photographic satellites, electronic emissions are picked up by certain types of satellites. There are lots of intelligence gathering devices that are up in space. The Soviets have a lot of them. You could put this information together in that space station. They put that information together on the ground. But the point is, when you've got lots of satellites looking at all kinds of places in the world in a conflict, and you've got a command post in space that's a backup for strategic forces, it also could be a command post for military, just basic conventional forces. Okay? You could use a large space station as a maintenance platform. In fact, I think that would be one of its main uses. Let us suppose that the Soviets were to build a Star Wars system of the type that the U.S. is thinking about building. Now, there's several different technologies. Far-out lasers, far-out particle beams. The simplest technology, and the one that seems like it would be built by the United States if we build one, is based upon rockets. The rockets would be sent out from a spacecraft and slam into the side of a booster or slam into the side of a re-entry vehicle. If you built that kind of a system, and it's the simplest kind, and therefore the type the Soviets would tend to build, they go for simple things, elegant solutions. If you went for that kind, and if you were the Soviets, where they have reliability problems, as you said earlier, you asked me about our boosters, they have much higher reliability problems. Their satellites break much more frequently than our own. If you went with that kind of a rocket-type system, it's called kinetic energy, hitting something very fast and destroying it, you would have to put up many hundreds, perhaps several thousands of satellites. Now, if you were the Soviet Union and had a record of satellite failures, and you were going to put up several thousand upon which you were going to defend your whole nation from attack, or from a counterattack, more likely, you'd want to make sure they worked. And you wouldn't want to have to replace them every week or every month. Therefore, what you'd like to do is to fix them in space. You'd like to have a service station in space, a maintenance facility in space, and you'd need a lot of people to man it. Well, a 100-man space station would be a wonderful thing to have for that. Now, the space station can't just move anywhere. When you go into an orbit, you tend to go around in the same plane, in a circle. The satellites might be going somewhere else. You'd have to go pick them up. A space plane would be a very nice device to pick up those satellites. That is, if the space plane had enough fuel. Now, the big booster that I mentioned that the Soviets launched this year can put up anywhere from 200,000 pounds to, say, 330,000 pounds. Could, as a payload, just put up fuel. Now, that's an awful lot of fuel for a space plane. It could go a long, long way with that amount of fuel. So I think the space plane, refueled at a space station, could go out and get broken satellites as part of a Star Wars system, bring them back to the space station and be repaired. So those are some ways you can use the space station. You could use it for a lot of other things too.
You were speaking of the strategic advantage in war of surveillance on troop movements, submarines.
Yes.
Everything we would be doing.
That's right. We are very, very dependent on space. Let me go back. You know, many years ago, I guess for thousands of years, people have fought wars on the sea and on the ground. It was just this century that we came up with the idea of the airplane. And at first, people didn't know what to do with it, and they started looking through glasses and sending messages, and pretty soon people were shooting at each other. And the airplane became quite important, and finally we set up a separate service for it. It was a military environment, the third military environment. It became very important to have control of that environment. Space is a fourth military environment. At least that's the way the military on the Soviet side looks at it. On our side, we haven't quite decided whether it's a military environment or not. There's a great debate in this country. Many people think it's a pristine environment and should remain so, a scientific place to do experiments. And it is that, and it's a wonderful place for that. But I think that in this country, we haven't gone as far as the Soviets in recognizing realities. It is another environment, and if there are important things in space, they will have to be protected if you live in a world that's not totally free and where everybody doesn't work in cooperation. So both nations, in fact other nations, put up satellites in space that carry out support missions. What do I mean by that? Navigation satellites that help our troops know where they are. Individual troops will soon be able to know exactly within a few feet of where they are in the middle of a jungle. And they'll know their height above sea level by a backpack type transmitter that goes up to a satellite and comes down. The communications won't have to depend so much on the power of that walkie-talkie because it'll be going up to a satellite and back down. Reconnaissance satellites take pictures of where the forces are, and those pictures are gotten back to these intelligence fusion centers that I mentioned earlier. The Soviets have something called the Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite. You might remember some years back one crashed into Canada and spewed nuclear radiation across many miles of Canada. It's the only nuclear-powered satellite. It's not a little satellite. It's 5 tons, and it's a big reactor that's on that satellite. That Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, the reactor powers a very powerful radar that sends signals down to the ocean, and the idea is to bounce those signals off ships so that the satellite will know where our ships are all around the world. And that's a unique capability that they have. They also have the ELINT, Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, and that picks up emissions. Now, you've seen pictures, I'm sure, of all kinds of aircraft carriers, destroyers, and so on. They're full of antennas of all type. Very electronic age we're into in the Navy. And if any of those antennas are sending out any energy, which they have to do essentially to do their job, that energy is picked up by an ELINT satellite if one happens to be overhead. And through very complicated electronic means, the Soviets can tell where that ship is at any moment in time, and perhaps and probably tell what ship it is, or at least what type it is. So I won't bore you with all the details, but I guess the point is that just as we had 2 military environments and then we wondered how we would use airplanes in a military environment, and then they became very, very important, it's turned out we've become much more and more dependent as the space age has moved on spacecraft for support missions in peacetime and in wartime. The Soviets have recognized that, And they've put together capabilities to take out our satellites. For example, one of the capabilities that they have that we don't is an anti-satellite capability. They've had an operational anti-satellite system since 1971. And if you look in the newspaper, maybe every couple months you'll see an article on our anti-satellite system. It's not something that's ready to go. It's a plan again, right? One of the reasons it's a plan, we haven't decided that space is a military environment. Even though we spend billions of dollars on space, and even though our forces, ground, sea, and air forces, are heavily dependent upon them, we have not set it as our goal or our mission to defend space and to make sure that we prevail if there's a war. The Soviets did set that goal, and in 1971 came up with an operational anti-satellite system. So they've got a lot of capabilities. We've got a lot of capabilities. Theirs are much more oriented towards warfare. And the name of that briefing was Soviet Space Warfare Capabilities. And what I did in that briefing was to say, if there were a war today, and it was 1983 then, how would the Soviets use space, and how would we use space? And what would be the likely outcome? And what would it be in 1993? Just 10 years down. And it was bad today, or at least it would have been bad in 83. Luckily, we didn't have such a war. And it would be much worse in 1993. For example, in the anti-satellite area, as I said, we're still discussing whether we should have one or not. And the Soviets don't just have one, they have several. They've got ground-based lasers that are still in the testing stage, but though they're in the testing stage, they can knock out satellites, our satellites, in space if a war should occur. They have an anti-ballistic missile system around Moscow that's there to take out reentry vehicles off of ICBMs should war occur, but they could also be used against satellites. That's today. In the future, we would expect, and the Department of Defense expects, that they will go to lasers in space, laser weapon systems in space. Now, this is not in the year 2100 or in the year 2000, but we're talking in the relatively near future. Tests that could occur before this decade is out. And I like to say that's, if I were a military man still and in the space program, and I would have the job of trying to defend this country or to ensure that it's secure, I would like to have that kind of capability.
Right now, we seem to be in a situation where we're vulnerable to a first strike. We're not pursuing in space our defenses. I don't even believe we're defending our satellites in space, are we?
No, just with passive measures. And not very many satellites have that. What I mean by passive measures is if a ground-based laser could burn a hole through a satellite, if it was totally unprotected, you might want to put a thin film of gold mylar or something around it so that you'd have to have, say, a 10,000-watt laser to burn a hole through it. All right? But there are no active measures to defend those satellites.
But the Soviets are defending their satellites, are they not?
Well, I wouldn't say that they are defending their satellites. What they have is an ability to destroy our satellites. And they've also put together an ability to surge the number of satellites that they have up at any one time. And now that's an interesting story. The numbers vary from year to year, but I think in 1986 it was something like we put up about 16 satellites, and they put up around 100. At any given time, some satellites fail, and we might have 100 up there that are active, and ours last a long time. They have about perhaps 150 satellites up. Now, the Department of Defense says, and I agree, that over 90% of Soviet satellites support their military forces. They're either directly involved with a military mission like that radar that paints the ocean to find out where our military ships are, or their support. Communication satellites that are sometimes used for civil purposes or governmental purposes that are not military. But about 90%. And that compares to about 30% on our side.
Well,
so,
go ahead. This is the information you gave the President America's intelligence and military community is more aware for your effort than they were before. You mentioned a certain elation when the President gave his inaugural address in 1984.
Yes.
And he made a very special announcement at that time that you felt was or could have been triggered by the information he received from your briefing. Can you tell us about that?
Right. Well, as I said in my brief book here, that after I gave the President that briefing, when I was there at the White House in the Situation Room, he really does have jelly bellies, you know, in bowls, nice crystal bowls. And while no one was looking, I took a little handful and put them in my pocket. And I went home, and I have 7 children and my wife, and they all asked, well, you know, what happened? What happened? You finally talked to the President. Did he listen? And I said, yes, he listened, but he didn't say anything. So I don't know what he thought. I know what the Secretary of Defense thought, because he said something before and after the briefing, and he'd heard the briefing several times before. I said, but I think you can infer that the President not only listened, but wants to do something about this situation if in the next few months he announces plans for a permanent space station for the United States. So that was in August of '83. And in January of '84, on the night of the State of the Union address, I just happened to be on National Public Radio, and I was being interviewed. Actually, it was a debate and an interview on Strategic Defense Initiative. And the woman asked that same question, because we had been just talking beforehand, and I just told her that story. And right afterwards, the President came on in his State of the Union address, and one of the things he announced was that the United States would go forward and put up a permanently manned space station by the middle of the next decade. And I went home later, and the kids said, yeah, they all screamed and yelled, because the President must have been listening back in August when I was briefing him.
What has happened to his plan?
Well, unfortunately, I think they probably have gone a bit awry. Not so much on space station. Space station is still moving along. That's being planned. It has some problems, of course, with the space shuttle. But his plans, I think the best response to the Soviet space threat is the Strategic Defense Initiative. And I would say that a lot of good work is being done on a Strategic Defense Initiative. A lot of scientific work, a lot of engineering work, a lot of conceptual work, but there's been no decision to deploy it. And it's kind of similar to United States studies of the space plane in the past. We did a lot of conceptual work, spent a lot of money, but we never decided to deploy. And the Soviets have put one into space. We did the same thing on the large booster. I mean, I was part of those studies. We didn't build it. The Soviets did. And I guess I would hate to live in a world where we've spent a lot of money thinking about ballistic missile defense, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. But we never deployed it, and the Soviets did. And that really is why I wrote TZAR Wars, because I guess if I had to make a judgment, I think there's a greater probability that if there is ever going to be a ballistic missile defense system in space, it'll be called TZAR Wars rather than Star Wars.
They'll be up first.
They'll be up first. Now, who cares if they're up first? I mean, we all assume, or most people in the United States assume, that if ever a space-based ballistic missile defense system goes up, we will put it up. That the Soviets couldn't possibly do it unless we gave them the technology. So it's either we either build one, and then maybe the Soviets will build one too if we help them, or none will ever be built. And I submit that that's not a reasonable reading of the tea leaves. We have essentially right now no expendable boosters, now a few. We have a space shuttle that won't fly, and the Soviets have got not eight boosters, but actually it's more than 8 now, 10, a change from 8 to 10 in the last couple of years. 10 different types of expendable boosters, of which they launch over 100 per year. Okay? And one of those is the big booster. They've got the space plane. They've got 8 space stations. We have plans for space station. The technologies that you would need for Strategic Defense Initiative, as I said, lasers or particle beams, those are high technology, far-off, second, third generation ballistic missile defense. Most everybody agrees that if it's ever going to be built, that's second or third generation. However, the Soviets are not behind us in those technologies. Most experts would agree that they're either ahead of us in particle beam and laser technology, or they're equal to us. But that's second or third generation. What about first generation? Well, first generation requires the ability to put up a lot of weight into orbit. They have that capability, or will have it soon. Actually, they have it now. They put up about 660,000 pounds per year into space. For a long time, we put up 0 pounds because of our space problems. So what bothers me is that the Soviets, while they say over and over and over that they are against strategic defense, I believe they're against the United States having strategic defense. And I very much appreciate, Mrs. Prophet, the ability to say these things and to get them on videotape, because I have a lot of faith in the American people. I think they make a lot of sense. They're very aware, if they know the facts. And this is a chance to get those facts out. Really well. The long applause has made me forget the point I was on. So go ahead.
What I'd like to get across to the American people is that for at least 30 years, according to John Cena, who defected, as you know, from Czechoslovakia, it has been the primary goal of the Soviet Union to have the capability to launch a first strike and to survive. And they plan on surviving a nuclear war. And it doesn't seem to me that the American people understand that with all of their rhetoric, they're simply moving forward according to plan since the time of Lenin to the present, to the very present, that they plan this war. And that when they find the United States vulnerable, when we cannot meet a first strike, when we cannot safely launch a second, and so forth, at that moment, when they consider themselves ready, I don't know when that moment is going to be, but when they find that moment, when they find that window, their political theory, their military posture says that this is what they want to do.
Well, I think what they want to do is dominate the world. I don't think they want to incinerate the United States. Because if they dominate the world and the United States is incinerated, you've lost an awfully big asset. I think they'd like to dominate a living, breathing United States with all its cities intact and all of its people ready to be subjugated.
This we can see, but what I don't understand is that the Pentagon, the powers that be, the Congress, these are our representatives. They must know this. America used to be a nation of the can-do spirit, and now we're thinking and planning, and everything is 5 and 10 years ahead.
That's
the
right.
Soviets must know this. They must know we are at our worst moment right now from the defense posture, since we don't have an ABM system.
Yeah, I think they do know this. Many times when I would give briefings in trying to get people to understand the Soviets, I would say, this is an oversimplification, but Americans play checkers and the Soviets play chess.
That's true.
Right? Now, we're good checker players and we play real fast. But they're superb chess players, and they play very slowly, but they play well. So I think they've looked ahead, and I think they see the opportunity they have now and the opportunities they have in the future, and they plan their forces quite well. The problem hasn't been in the Pentagon with respect to the offensive forces. The problem has been the civilians in Washington, in the policies that they set. Now, I'm not saying they were bad people. These are very complicated issues. I'm a policy analyst myself, and it's not obvious what one has to do. You have to think about it at length. But many years ago, it was decided that the best way to protect oneself against attack was not to try to defend yourself by shooting an airplane down or shooting a missile down, but it was to say, look, we are totally vulnerable to an attack. We don't even have civil defense. We're not going to shoot down one of your airplanes, and we're not going to stop one of your ballistic missiles. So therefore, don't ever attack us. Because we'll be destroyed. And, you know, in revenge, we will destroy you. That's called mutual assured destruction. And its advocates, and they were many years ago when that was advocated, a lot of debates. They're still around today in Washington. I see them at meetings. I see them in elevators. I hear their arguments. And they still believe it's a valid argument. It's immoral, I believe. I think it's totally immoral to And I hate to say this, but the Soviets have a moral strategic posture. Okay, they're in this sense, at least. Their posture is, if we, the Soviets, ever attack, we're going to attack the U.S. military forces, and as a matter of fact, their nuclear forces. Well, those are out here, unfortunately, in the West, in Wyoming, they're in Missouri, places like that, but at least they're not around the cities. They would use nuclear forces to knock out our nuclear forces, to prevent our nuclear forces from blowing up their cities. Of course, I don't think any nuclear war particularly would be moral, but at least it is more moral a posture than one that says we're going to destroy their cities if the balloon goes up. I personally doubt whether a moral president who has already sustained an attack, and no president is going to launch on warning of an attack, I don't think, because it might be wrong. He doesn't want to be responsible for starting a nuclear war. The best thinking says if an attack should ever come, the president would wait for the explosions to go off, assuming he were alive, or somebody in the chain of command were alive, and that's not so clear that that would be the case. A decision would be made, and essentially the decision would be, shall I now attack the other guy's cities? That's essentially the only thing he could do. Or shall I not? If he attacks the other guy's cities, and the Soviets have attacked Wyoming and the Ozarks, but not our cities. If he attacks their cities, our cities will be destroyed. It's a suicide response. He might do it out of revenge, but the whole point of the threat is to make sure they never attack us. Once they've attacked, he would be committing suicide. So it's somewhat doubtful whether he would actually retaliate. Now, no president's going to ever say, no, I wouldn't retaliate, because that takes away the power of the whole nuclear strategy of mutual assured destruction. But I believe it's ridiculous, insane policy. It's the best policy perhaps we could have come up with in the time, because the technology wasn't there. But the technology is there now to change to a different strategy, one that is based upon actual defenses. We could, for many years, have defended against airplanes, but we chose not to because we had no ability to defend against ballistic missiles. Now, the technology is there to do so. What's lacking is a clear political will to do so. The Soviets, now take a look from their viewpoint, they have spent about an equal amount on strategic defenses, not just recently, but for many, many years. as they have on their strategic offenses. And we all know they have thousands of missiles and approximately 10,000 warheads now on submarine and ICBM missiles. So they've got a big offensive force. And yet they spend an equal amount of money yearly on strategic defenses. What we're spending today is maybe $3.4 billion a year on a new initiative. Okay, they're spending about $20 billion on an old initiative. So they've got the plan and they've got the infrastructure. The space station, you need a space station. A space plane, you need a space plane. You need big boosters. You need a lot of expendable boosters. You need the space shuttle, by the way. If the space station is going to fix the TZAR satellites, and you need a lot of people on board, you need an entire fleet of space shuttles just to bring the cosmonauts up and back. Because after about 6 months, they get sick, tremendously sick. They really do. So you've got to bring people back and forth. After 237 days, that was the longest the Soviets spent in space, they examined those Soviet cosmonauts, and they had suffered mental deterioration, cerebellum. It was many weeks before they could play a child's game of catch with a ball after 237 days in space. No one understands why this occurs yet. So anyway, you need a fleet of orbiters just to bring the people up and back before they deteriorated to too large an extent. So they're building the infrastructure. They've got the objective of domination of the world. We know they have a written space doctrine of domination of space in order to achieve victory in warfare. And I believe they're building, or getting ready to build, although it cannot be proven, a TZAR war system. Now, if they put up a TZAR war system, and we haven't gotten one up yet, then the Politburo is faced with a decision. And no doubt they will argue about it, because although we look upon the Soviet Union as a monolithic entity, it's really made up of a lot of people that argue a lot, just like over here. The difference is, once they decide, and it's only a few people, a handful of people, they basically stick to that decision. Whereas here, we vote people out of office and we decide again, the next year.
The Politburo is faced with a decision. They have an SDI,
right.
We don't have an SDI.
We're off in the future, that's right. In the future, they've got an SDI, we don't have an SDI, and they're faced with a decision. Do they announce that they've got it and suggest that the United States build one too? It's a possibility. Or do they take a very big risk, and it would be a big risk, but sometimes risks are worth it for a big reward, and this would be the biggest of all possible rewards, the world. At least from their viewpoint, we might think it's our souls, but from their materialistic viewpoint, it's the world. Take the risk of saying to the United States, we have got a system up. And by the way, here's an announcement for the United Nations. We are going to do a big favor for everybody and make sure that the West can no longer launch their missiles against anybody. And of course, we, the Soviets, are not going to do it. And tell the United States we don't want to see another ballistic missile defense system in space. Now, if you think about it, if a ballistic missile defense system can stop hundreds and thousands of missiles that are simultaneously launched, and it would have to stop them to be anywhere near effective, it certainly can stop one space shuttle flight or one expendable booster. And that's the way we're going to have to put up our system, one at a time. So if we don't have our system up yet, and theirs is operational, and if they take the political risk, they can say, don't put up any more shuttle flights or expendable boosters with your SDI system on board. And essentially, we wouldn't be able to. If we launched, they'd shoot it down with their system. It would be a tremendous political risk. Now, if they took that risk and we were effectively prevented, we would be effectively prevented from putting the system up, it would be as if we were tremendously poor negotiators in Geneva. Now let's say the system were 90% effective. It could stop 90% of the warheads. It would be like we went to Geneva and the Soviets and we signed an agreement where we gave up 90% of all of our warheads and they gave up none of theirs. It would cause a tremendous change in the balance of military power. The perception of power would move, I believe, to the Soviets in a large way. People would say they seem to be winning the game. Yesterday, the United States could have all of its missiles land on a Soviet territory. Today, only 10%. And today, the Soviets can have all of its missiles land on United States territory. In addition, the Soviets can now improve their TZAR war system next year, the year after, the year after. And we can never put one up. So it moves from 90% to 95% to 99.9%. It moves from defense against ballistic missiles to defense against aircraft. They could, over a reasonably short period of time, essentially zero out any nuclear capability that the West would have while maintaining their own. And I guess I would maintain that what would happen is our strong friends would remain strong. Our weak friends would probably very quickly not be our friends. Our moderate friends would tend to become weak friends. And as time went on, you would find political realignments, economic realignments. And the Soviets would essentially win without firing a shot. And earlier, Mrs. Prophet, you said something about a nuclear war. I don't believe they want to incinerate the United States because they may get incinerated. They may not in return. But they would sure like to have the whole world to play with, including all the assets in the U.S., and impose their system, which is total lack of freedom, on the United States and the West. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that technology has brought us to the point where the Soviets have that possibility open to them, but only because we're not moving fast enough. Because we've got better technology than them. What they've got better than us is political will to use it.
And a plan.
Pardon me?
And a plan.
They've got a plan that somebody has signed and said, this is a final plan. We have many plans.
But in the course of this plan, where they do not want to destroy the United States, they have an option of taking out our military capability. And I'm not convinced that they wouldn't exercise it.
Well,
I do feel that they would hesitate to nuke out the whole country. But even the capacity to do so, as we have seen already, the United States is compromised on all kinds of positions around the world because, oh, we don't want to incite the Soviets to a nuclear war. So this is already working with them.
Right. They don't have to fire the missiles in order for the missiles to be effective. But they could fire the missiles. And if they did, there is a large imbalance that probably a lot of people don't know about. Part of this mutual assured destruction philosophy that I mentioned earlier, where we said, if you attack us, we will be so hurt that we will have to destroy you in turn. Part of that rationale said, well, what you don't want to do, the big thinkers, policymakers in Washington, were to build missiles, our missiles, that could destroy their weapons.
Right.
We need to build missiles that can destroy their people.
Right.
Okay. As a matter of fact,
it's contradictory because we don't believe in killing people.
Well, yeah, but you'd be surprised. That has gotten... Yeah, it is contradictory because we know they do believe in killing people. Look at Afghanistan, et cetera, and our own moral values and so on. But we have embraced this policy, mutual assured destruction, which is totally at odds with our moral philosophy. And they embraced a strategic doctrine which is totally at odds with their moral structure.
That's right.
It's kind of interesting. But, and they're going to win that way. And one of the reasons is we're not following our moral beliefs.
The logic of taking out their military establishment should be obvious to every American. The story only needs to get to them.
Yeah. It's, It's got to get to the decision makers in Washington. And believe me, there isn't just one. I mean, there's hundreds. And, you know, they're in the Congress, they're in the administration, and so on. But a couple years ago, I went to a high school reunion, and one of the fellows in my class had a son who was getting up there, 18, 19, 20. He was at college. And he knew that I worked on ballistic missile defense and defense things. And he said, I have one question for you. He said, why is it you work on this? He said, we all know from our college classes, he said, that weapons that kill weapons are bad. And weapons that kill people are good. Now, why is it you work on this thing? Because it's going to kill weapons, not people. And he asked me that in all sincerity, and he was a good kid. His father's a good man. And I just smiled at him, and I thought for a second, and I said, well, what do you think Jesus would think of that philosophy that you've learned at college? And he stopped for a second, and he said, I guess that's wrong, isn't it? The point I want to make is that 19 or 20-year-old person only needed to reflect for 10 seconds to see the ridiculous nature of the strategy that he had embraced. Unthinkingly, he was taught that. And most people in the United States have unthinkingly embraced that strategy. We were taught that. The way you defend yourself is to threaten to annihilate the opposition. There is no real way to defend yourself.
The other angle to this is we should remember that originally it is the intention of this nation to liberate oppressed peoples and to defend freedom in every nation. And thereby, if we would hit the Soviet military bases, we would be liberating their people.
Well, I don't know if I can agree with that one, Mr. Prophet. You won't get me to say that you can fight a nuclear war and win it.
Just as a strategy, though.
Well,
at least
as a strategy,
at least the Russian people would be there.
I'll go along with that. It would be better if we had weapons that could destroy their weapons. Now, because you could also use those, if you wished, to destroy their people. Because they have to be very accurate to destroy weapons. And the Soviets have that ability. But we have chosen to develop weapons that can only destroy people. Doesn't make much sense. We don't have an option to destroy their weapons should we want to change our strategy even. But I think the best of all strategy is to get rid of the weapon. And that's what President Reagan set out to do. And most people don't understand that. A lot of people say SDI or Star Wars or ballistic missile defense cannot work because it has to be perfect. President Reagan said it had to be perfect. It's to make sure no one in the United States can ever die from a nuclear weapon. He did not say that. What he said was he wanted to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Now that doesn't mean that he's going to guard every inch of the border of the United States so no one could ever bring in a suitcase and set off an atomic bomb in Kansas. What it means is he wants to make the continued acquisition of greater arsenals and the maintenance of the present arsenals so expensive, so ridiculous, so having nothing to do with an objective that the Soviets would wish to carry out, that they get rid of them because they're impotent. They cannot carry out their objective. Yeah, you could get 1 or 2 or 3 into the United States, but that is not a sensible military objective. And the Soviets, again, are chess players, not interested in incinerating a few cities, but interested in dominating the world and using their military forces as well as possible.
Why don't you tell us about putting in low-tech systems while we develop Star Wars so that we have something that can turn them back? Tell us about Iris and Hit-Eye and kinetic kill vehicles.
Okay.
And the ones we already developed and took down that we have the power to put up right now to thwart this world takeover.
Okay. When we say low-tech, we mean extremely high-tech but not to the summit of Mount Everest, as some of those systems are. None of these systems are low-tech, but some of them are achievable today, and some of them are achievable tomorrow. The Army in 1984, I believe in June, had a homing overlay experiment in which an ICBM warhead was shot from California towards, I think it was Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific, and a Army missile was sent up, and you may remember it on television. It looked like kind of an umbrella. All it did was open up this big metal thing. And if you're traveling real fast and you run into something, you get hurt. And at 25,000 feet per second, to run into a metal umbrella, you destroy yourself. And that missile ran into that umbrella, or the umbrella ran into the missile. That's essentially what ARIS would be. It's a missile that can go up into space and maybe go downrange 100 miles or 200 miles or 300 miles or something like that, and intercept incoming warheads. HEDI is another system.
When could we deploy that?
I think it's deployable.
So if the president decided he wants to deploy it...
Probably a few years. Probably a few years.
24 months?
Well, I'm not the program director of the ARIS system, and I probably will run into him in an elevator soon, so I don't want to say that it's exactly 24 months, but it's, somewhere around there. We're not talking 5 years from now. That system is deployable, in the relatively near future. The Soviets also have such a system deployable in the relatively near future.
Are they intending to deploy it?
Well, again, you never know with the Soviets, but you have to guess, and I would guess yes. I would guess, let me modify that. I would guess that they are keeping the option open to deploy it. In the United States, we keep the option open to develop something. They keep the option open to deploy something. They build them, and it's a question of, do they build 10 or do they build 1,000? Sometimes they build 1,000 and put them in storage and decide to deploy it another time, or decide never to. But the Pentagon says that the Soviets are developing all the components of a ground-based anti-ballistic missile system. Now, we know they have one around Moscow, and we know it's being updated now, but this is one that would be mobile and deployable within months across the Soviet Union. Now, I'm not saying they could put 8,000 of them out there in 3 months, but the point is, each site you could put out in a few months, rather than taking years to build, because they're mobile, like trucks with missiles on them. And it would take several years to put together an adequate force. They're putting together the infrastructure for that. Should they make the political decision, and maybe they made it yesterday, I don't know, or maybe they made it a year ago, or maybe they will never make it. But should they make that decision, they will be able to deploy a ground-based system relatively soon after the decision. Much sooner than ours, even though ours is only a few years. They could do it in a few months. Now that's what they call a mid-course system. Why is it a mid-course? Because when the booster takes off, it's in a boost phase of its flight towards its target. Then it goes into a post-boost phase where the booster falls off, and now you have a thing called a bus. And it's called a bus because it drops off a reentry vehicle, and then it moves off to another destination and drops off one and moves off and drops off another until it drops off all of them, maybe 10 or 12 reentry vehicles. That's a post-boost phase. The next one is a mid-course phase where it coasts for 20 minutes, each reentry vehicle. And ARIS would operate in the mid-course phase. The next phase is right before it comes into the atmosphere, called the pre-entry phase. ARIS could work in that phase also. And the next phase is where it's coming into the atmosphere, and we've all seen pictures on TV of a reentry vehicle coming in very, very fast and hitting Eniwetok Atoll out in the Pacific. And that would be the terminal phase. That's where the HEDI system comes in, which is a very fast missile that goes up and intercepts. Now, these are different from the technologies you might remember, or the audience might remember, that used nuclear weapons to destroy incoming warheads. Back in the early 70s, we actually deployed a system, and it was operational for 3 months, and then due to mutual assured destruction decision, was destroyed. We got rid of it. And the Soviets deployed theirs and kept it due to having a different strategy. But those systems, and still the Soviet system today, by the way, have nuclear warheads on the tip of them. And so as a warhead comes in, the rocket goes up, nuclear explosion occurs, and of course it destroys the warhead. The new technologies of Head-Eye and Era, some similar technologies, allow you to actually hit it with a metal umbrella. Okay? So those are, they're not low-tech, but they're not tremendously expensive. We have tested many elements of those, and as I said, we've actually intercepted under very special conditions. Now, the other low-tech, you call it low-tech, is a kinetic energy system where the rocket actually runs into a booster or into a reentry vehicle. And, well, that technology is as old as the Chinese invention of the rocket, right? All we're talking about now is can you get many thousands of them into space, and can you find out where the targets are in a few seconds and get all the things to the right places? It takes big computers, lots of planning, lots of logistics, and so on. But what it doesn't take is physical breakthroughs, you know, like the invention of the atomic bomb took or something like that. Senator Waltz made a real good point in a talk. I hope you don't mind my digressing.
Do.
For a second. You know, a lot of people say, this Star Wars is so difficult it can't be built. And I heard him on March 23rd, 1987, which was the 4th anniversary of President Reagan's speech that said, let's build this, or let's start a research program to look into this. He says it's been 4 years since we started this research program. That's more time than our total involvement in World War II. And yet we're still doing research. And in World War II, we built 140,000 aircraft. We built 100 aircraft carriers. And we invented the atomic bomb. And we beat Japan and Germany in less time than it's been since the president announced SDI. We still don't know if we're going to build it or not. Well, if we can invent the atomic bomb from scratch, I submit we ought to be able to take semi-off-the-shelf and off-the-shelf technology and put it up in the reasonably near future.
Now, why don't we just get it up at 90% accurate, 85% accurate? Why can't we have a deterrence in space?
Well, we could. It's a political decision, not a technological decision. I don't believe it's a money decision. It's that same argument between people who want mutual assured destruction as their basic policy and those who want what is called mutual assured survival, which is depending on defenses, actually on both sides. It's the basis, I think, for a bright future. But see, some people think it's a basis for a bleak future. And I think it's a wonderful country because people can have those arguments and that they don't get killed or sent off to Siberia. But it's a bad country in that we argue interminably and we don't resolve these things. And even when we elect people to office, asking them to act, they temporize, hoping for a consensus or hoping for a large group of people that will agree with exactly the way they go, way they think things should go. I think there needs to be some real leadership in this area, and I'm not faulting President Reagan. He took leadership. I mean, no one was telling him to do what he did when he announced that initiative. I think he expects the people are doing their job, and they'll come tell him when they're ready. They are waiting for him to tell them to deploy it.
Maybe we should tell him to tell them to
That's
deploy
right.
it.
That's right. That's about it. And, you know, I said it's a political problem because obviously there's people around the president whose job it is just to worry about the Strategic Defense Initiative, and then there's other people whose job it is just to worry about defense. And so they know the status of these systems and so on, but they have to worry about political arguments, and it will be one heck of a big political argument to deploy a ballistic missile defense system, because if you say you're going to deploy it, you must back out of the ABM treaty, you see. And we signed that ABM treaty, and there's a whole lot of people who think, you know, that's about the worst thing the United States could ever do, would be to
But
get
the
out of that
Soviets have
ABM.
violated that treaty.
Yes.
We should withdraw from that treaty.
Well, there's some people that say even though the other side violates it, that doesn't mean you should. Two wrongs don't make a right. But I think a better argument is that not so much, if the Soviets had never violated it, if Strategic Defense Initiative, the deployment of it, is in your supreme national interest, and not only that, you believe it's in the world's interest, you shouldn't let the ABM treaty stand in your way, especially since you had the foresight when you signed the ABM treaty to put a clause in there that said 6 months after you announce it's no longer in your interest, this treaty is null and void, which is in that treaty. I mean, it's not like we signed up for all eternity. The clause is right in there if we think it's not in our interest. What the president has to do is say it's no longer in our interest. And we are now getting out of the treaty. But see, there's a lot of people who think it is in our interest to stay with that treaty, and feel that mutual assured destruction is the appropriate way. They say it has kept the peace for 40 years, 42 years, and it's hard to argue with that. I mean, did mutual assured destruction keep the peace, or was it something else? Who knows? We know we didn't have a nuclear war. They say if you go to Strategic Defense Initiative, that's a whole new ball game. Maybe some instabilities will arise. Maybe there'll be a war. I understand their viewpoint. I happen to think it's wrong. But they're sincere, and they've thought it out. And they will raise one heck of a political stink if that ABM treaty goes away and if the president should announce deployment. And that's what they're worried about. They're trying to build the proper political base. Now, the point I want to make is that's probably the way. I'm not a politician, but I understand politicians. They need to build a political base. But if in World War II, after Pearl Harbor was attacked, we said, well, wait a minute, would you wait about 4 to 6 years, Japan? We need to build a consensus opinion on what we should do. It wouldn't have been good. And what bothers me is I think that many of our policymakers in Washington are not aware of, or if they're aware of it, they haven't thought about it lately, that they don't have all the time in the world. And the thing that there's two things that say that decision on deployment ought to be made soon. One is that the Soviets might deploy their own system, and I already went through what would happen or what could happen if they deployed their system before us. Domination of the earth. The other reason is it's just one more day under mutual assured destruction, which, if there's ever an accident, be it a mechanical or electronic or human failure that's catastrophic, and we saw evidence of catastrophic failures in very complex systems, it's essentially the end of civilization as we know it. But the problem is that doesn't offer any sense of immediacy, because people say, well, we've gone through 42 years of that. Surely we can go through, another 4, 5, 6, 10, hopefully 15 years. But the real sense of immediacy is the Soviet threat and their plans for a strategic defense system. But since most of the policymakers are not considering that, they don't feel that sense of immediacy. So why make a decision now? We can avoid a lot of political problems.
You know, the government is bound by the Constitution to protect the states from foreign invasion. It is not doing so in space. If you were to suggest the immediate way of protecting our hard targets, our military installations, to fulfill this requirement of defense, self-defense, and save this nation from its consciousness of national suicide, what would you suggest today?
Well, the first step would be, besides the political steps, the first step would be to get out of that treaty. Because the first thing you ought to deploy, if you're going to try and defend the United States, is probably a ground-based terminal defense system like HEAD-I or ARIS that we talked about earlier, or both, probably both. And we are bound by that treaty not to have more than 100 missiles, and 100 missiles is not enough. You see, so you got to get out of the treaty first. And then you deploy as many missiles as you need to basically to buy back that deterrent that we've lost. Because the Soviets built 5,000 warheads that are as accurate as the MX, of which we have only 10 missiles employed many years after we first thought about putting them in. That's a long, involved sentence. But we lost a lot of our counterpunch. The credibility of our deterrent, even under MAD, has been reduced considerably. Putting in these ground-based missiles would restore some of that deterrence, but it would still depend on MAD. What you'd need to do then is to go to a space-based system and a space-based kinetic energy system, and do it with as much haste as possible. And so I would announce deployment of that. I'd find out first how soon I could deploy it, and then I'd tell the guys to beat it by 6 months. Because they can do it. I would also, if I were the president, I would order NASA and or the Air Force, or both, to develop a very large booster of the type the Soviets launched in the last month or two in 1987. Because that will make the job of putting up a space-based defense system 10, 15 times easier as far as the logistics go. I won't bore you with all the details, but even if the shuttle were working properly, it would take many years to put all that weight up into space, and it isn't working properly. It isn't working at all at the moment. You need a large booster. I'd also move forward as quickly as possible with plans for that space station, and I'd make it bigger than it is going to be, at least under the present plans. And the big booster would allow you to put up that space station much quicker and have an earlier operational date. I would also, and this sounds like a lot of money, but it isn't when you compare it to other military expenditures, I would develop what's known as a space cruiser, similar to the Soviet space plane. There's a very interesting concept, probably for several $100 million could be developed, a one-man space cruiser. Probably the most important thing, other than the basic decision to deploy SDI, if I were the president, I would send to Congress a bill, and by the way, Senator Wallop and Representative Jack Kemp have already introduced this bill on April the 2nd, 1987. I would send a bill from the president, though, presidency, a bill that would form a fourth military service. We've got the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. The Marines are part of the Navy, okay? But this would be the U.S. Space Force. That bill... There's 4 military environments: ground, sea, air, and space. We're finally coming around to realizing it. If I were the president, I would realize it, all right? Now, you need almost, I think it's almost essential to have a fourth military service if SDI, or ballistic missile defense, or Star Wars, whatever you want to call it, is ever to go through. And I'll tell you why. And this is something that most people wouldn't know I only know because I've lived in the Pentagon for a long time, and I've been in the military for many years. It's hard to believe, at least this is my personal judgment, that the U.S. Army, Navy, or Air Force will by itself ever deploy an effective ballistic missile defense system. It's even harder to believe that they will cooperatively deploy such a system. Because, you know, they do have problems cooperating, and just like anybody does. But individually, why would they not? I mean, you would think the president could say, after he's decided to deploy Air Force. But that's not the way the bureaucracy works. First of all, the president wouldn't say it that way. It would be issued in some kind of a directive that had lots of caveats in it. And the Air Force's job, and they're very good people, is basically to gain control of the air. That's their mission statement. And those people are very dedicated, patriotic people who have spent their entire life thinking up ways and honing their skills to defend the air over the United States or over Europe or wherever the president wants to send the forces. The Navy has been told to defend the sea, and they've had 200 years of experience of maintaining or gaining control of the sea. And an Army, the same thing for the ground. Nobody has any experience controlling space. Now, obviously somebody would have to gain it if it were ever to happen. And so you would say, well, I could get some Air Force people to do that, or Army people, or Navy people. The problem would be is that basically the Air Force flies planes, the Navy drives carriers and subs, and the Army drives tanks. And if you tell them also to command 2,000 satellites, what they will do is to allocate approximately 8% of their budget towards that job and say, we don't need 2,000, we only need 200. And we don't need them next year, we need them 5 years from now. And by the way, why don't we study that some more? Now, that's not a wild statement. When I was at the Pentagon, and I'm not giving anything away, but I was on committees that passed, they pass on at Pentagon committees on the most mundane things, like should certain helicopter gunships have a refueling device installed on them or not? Well, you say, well, naturally they should, because they're intended to get from point A to B, and they can't get there without it. But the cost is $14 million, and they don't get installed because there's not enough money. It goes to something else. There are just more things, there are more requirements placed on the military than the population is willing to give the military in terms of money. And I can just guarantee you that if the Air Force will decide not to put refueling things on its helicopters, things that fly in the air, because they don't have enough money, they won't spend what's required in space to put up a defense system. And I think anybody who's been around the military long enough would agree with me on that statement. Now, if you formed a fourth military service, however, what you have is people in the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, and Marines volunteer to go to that other service. And they would then very diligently work on the mission, and hopefully that service would be given a mission, which no organization, no military organization now has the mission of defending the United States against air attack, cruise missile attack, submarine ballistic missile attack, or ICBM attack. They don't have the mission, so naturally they're not carrying it out. But the Space Force, if it were given that mission, the people would move over. You wouldn't even have to give them a budget, because with 20 or 30,000 very intelligent, dedicated military people with that mission, you'd be sure they would have a budget, because they would know what in the Air Force, Army, and Navy is less important. They just came from there, all right? And they would win out in the competition. The money would flow into that service until the appropriate money went into that service to do that job. It's not that strategic defense is the only thing that needs to be done, but it is something that needs to be done, isn't being done. Nobody has the mission, and there's very little money being assigned to it. So, in answer, it's a long answer to your question. But the second most important thing would be to form a separate service. Did I make that point clear enough? I mean, do I need to?
Definitely, you made it clear. Definitely.
And I know my book's on TZAR wars, not Star Wars. So let me say on the Soviet side.
That's just what I was going to ask you.
Okay.
Tell them about the space service and how much men and money are dedicated to this. Research, scientists, and so forth.
They're organized a little differently than us. I won't go into all the details, but they have more services. But one of their services is a defense force. And it's an air defense force, and it's a space defense force. It was air defense. It went all the way back to about 1955. Strategic defense. And so they are organized to defend against incoming ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and bombers. And they've been organized for a long time. We used to be organized to defend against bombers, and then we chose not to be. And it just shows how bankrupt our policy is. And I just think I wish I had 3 minutes with every American to sit down, because I think in 3 minutes, I could convince them that
Will you please do that right now? Just take 3 minutes and give your speech to America in 3 minutes.
You're going to get it to all Americans, is that right?
Well, everybody out here is going to commit to do that, right? The thing I want to tell you, Tom, is when you talk for a couple of hours, sometimes your message gets strung out.
Oh, yeah.
And it's easier to get a 3-minute, a 10-minute, 15 or 30-minute cable television show on or a spot on. So I'm really serious.
Yeah.
Talk to America for 3 minutes right now and put it all together.
Oh, I don't know if I can do that.
Well, you asked for it. You've got it now.
Yeah. You have good editors, though, too. They can put this in. But many years ago, we had the ability to intercept Soviet bombers. Now, when I was 20 years old, and I hadn't gotten out of the college yet or gone into the Air Force, I went to go see my brother in Washington, who's a nuclear physicist. And his roommate was a pilot of an F-106. I forget what they call it, Delta Dart or had some neat name. And a very sleek Delta Wing fighter. Now, that was in 1961, and I saw that same fighter on the front page of Air Force Times just 2 weeks ago. It's basically the backbone of our air defense force in the United States. There's very few of them still operational. I mean, they're really old planes. Basically, the Soviets could take 1950s vintage, and they still have them, Bear bombers. These are strategic nuclear, capable of carrying nuclear weapons, strategic distances, piston engine planes, and fly them into the United States and drop their bombs. Not cruise missiles, not supersonic short-range attack missiles, but bombs that just drop down there on, city after city. And we wouldn't stop them because we don't have a defense. And that's what I'm saying. It's almost criminal that we don't have it. But I understand why we don't, because we couldn't stop the ballistic missiles. But knowing that we can stop ballistic missiles is just a political decision. We need to have the will to do it, to implement the technology. It's criminal, it seems to me, to not stop them, not try to stop them, and not stop the bombers or the cruise missiles, because we obviously have the technology and have had it since before I got out of college, and I'm 46 years old. And it is immoral to wrest the continued existence of this country on a policy that threatens the annihilation of another country, rather than defending this country, which is in the Constitution. And the highest, we spend over $300 billion a year to do a lot of things in the military, but not to defend this country from nuclear attack, which is the biggest threat we face. It's ridiculous.
As far as we are concerned, it is the obligation, first of all, of the individual to defend life where he is, of the head of a family to defend his family, and the fathers of a city to defend a city, whether it's against plague or diseases or some kind of an oncoming band of terrorists. It doesn't change in space. It doesn't change when it becomes a planetary scale. From Noah to the present, it's been our obligation, the obligation of governments, to defend life. You have perceived the perceptions of America and her government. You know what students are taught in college. And you know how this mad doctrine has lingered, even though it's obsolete. From your position, then, what do you think it will take? What kind of a concept or information to suddenly turn the light on in the American people and give Congress a reason to go ahead with your plan, because the people are behind Congress and the President in doing so?
Well, I don't know exactly what it would take. I mean, obviously, if everybody in the United States called up the President, he'd do it. Or if we all called up our congressmen, they would do it. But it's, you know, not likely that that would happen.
What's going to make him do it? What's going to make him do it?
Well,
what's got to happen to America to make it wake up?
Well, my honest opinion, if you're talking about President Reagan, is that something, President Reagan's administration, I love President Reagan, but my guess is that the Soviets are going to have to do something very startling to get this administration to decide to deploy in the next 18 months we have going. I think it's probably kind of unlikely that the Soviets will be stupid enough to do something so startling that it would force his hand, because I think that they don't want us to develop the system for the reasons I went through before. My guess is that there are a lot of people that have announced for the presidency that if they get in, will essentially cancel this program. I mean, they'll do more than not deploy it or put off the decision. They will cancel the program. So I guess if I had to recommend, the best way I think that the ballistic missile defense will be deployed is if the American people are smart enough to ask that question about the candidates for president. Do you or do you not favor defending in the very near term this nation from strategic attack, a la ballistic missile defense, ground-based and space-based? In other words, if some smart people ask those questions enough times, and if the American people listen to the answers and vote for the guy who says he will, I would bet we'll have one of those systems up. And if they don't, we probably won't have that kind of a system up.
And if they don't, and we won't, that chapter in your book about the bleak future.
Yeah, and in the way that chapter ends, and if I might just say, there's a bleak and the bright future, and it's kind of interesting how it goes through it, but in the bright future, in 1997, and the time frame is relatively accurate, the United States and the Soviet Union have a large spacecraft in low Earth orbit leaving their big space stations, and the captains are talking to each other over the microphone, and they both shove off for Mars. They've separate spacecraft. It's a peaceful space competition, and the background is basically most of the nuclear weapons have been gotten rid of, and by a way we haven't gotten into, the ability for anybody to wage large-scale conventional war has also been essentially gotten rid of through the same kind of SDI technology. That's the bright future. Economically, it's good. Politically, it's good. From threat, it's good. Everybody's defended. It's mutual assured survival. And we're now competing in space, and with all the technological spin-offs for both sides that happen from that. That's the bright future. In the bleak future, the Soviets are going to Mars. And the U.S. is still planning to launch its space station. And they've had to rewrite the manuals of operation so that they read in English and Russian because it's going to be a joint crew. And political realignments have occurred. So that's how the bleak future ends. Also there's an announcement from the Soviet Secretary General from a direct broadcast satellite that broadcasts all over the world, which will be coming up in whenever the Soviets allow it, essentially. They will not allow it right now. But in 1997, the Secretary General announces that the Soviet Union is going to Mars, and they're going to claim it for the free socialist nations of the world. And he asked everyone to join in his goal of making sure that all nations in the world are free and socialist by the 100th anniversary of the Soviet Revolution, which would be the year 2017, or 20 years after that date. And, you know, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I'll say this: I'd bet my life on it, and I'd bet my career on it, and I spend all my time working on it, because I believe that unless the American people elect a president this next term who will deploy a system, the bleak future type of announcement in 1997 will occur. And I'd hate to see that happen, because it would be hundreds of years before the people of the world were able to regain their freedoms.
We're now fielding questions with Thomas Krebs on the subject of TZAR wars, the Soviet version of SDI, and all that he's brought to us. So the first question is, I understand that the Pentagon bureaucracy did everything it could to keep you from giving your briefing to the president. What happened, and why the opposition?
Well, that's a long story, but I'll try to make it short. The people in the Pentagon, the people in the military that I know, are 99.9% very sincere, dedicated people. But as I mentioned before, they have a real sense of mission. And if they're in the Air Force, they got a different mission than the Army. And within the Air Force, they have submissions, or within the Army, they have submissions. And they're used to competing with the other services and within a service for resources. And they really do have to compete tooth and nail to make sure their program gets funding. And I guess that's a good process, because supposedly with a lot of smart people going back and forth, the right thing finally gets funded. Well, the best I can figure is that a lot of people in the services felt that if this briefing got to the president, he would feel something different needed to be done than was being done, and probably a rather expensive, different type of thing. And I mean, I know that actually, because I talked to a lot of staff members as I went around in the pre-briefs, and they essentially said they're afraid that their ox will be gored. They will lose funds for their pet projects, or the ones they've been working on for many years, and it would be diverted to some new initiative, a la the Strategic Defense Initiative. So that was a large part of it. And the briefing was I'll just do 2 minutes on what happened. The briefing was 50 minutes long, and it had to cover from the time the space Sputnik went up to the year 2000. And the whole Soviet space program, what had happened, what is happening, and what would happen, and what it meant to the United States. And one of the first things they did after running it through all kinds of people like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of policy, etc., was to tell me it had to be reduced to 10 minutes because the president was too busy to hear a 50-minute briefing. And I know that they thought it couldn't be done, and that that would be the reason it would be thrown out. We finally got it down to 10 minutes. I was working with another fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Skip Theobald. And chief scientists would even come into these meetings and come up with ridiculous suggestions. Well, I won't even go into the ridiculous suggestion, but I mean, they just went overboard to try and kill this briefing. I was in one very important policymaker's office, and the whole forces of the opposition were gathered. And I knew it was set up that this briefing wasn't going to go past this man that day. He was going to cut it off. And I gave my briefing. All the people around the room said it was no good for various sundry reasons. And he said, and I said a prayer. And I said, God, if you want this briefing to go on, do something, because they're about to cancel it. If you don't, okay, I'll do something else. And he said, well, gentlemen, thank you for all your inputs. I think that what we need to do with this briefing is to, and he stopped, and then he said, the trouble with this briefing, the idea of this briefing going to the president is just something that, and I'm serious, he could not finish a sentence. So that might not go over in, you know, all over America, but I know it'll go over in this audience, and that was true. The power of prayer really works. And now, then we went, the next briefing was to the Secretary of Defense, and different people were there, four-star generals, lots of people. They argued with the title slide. And, you know, when they argue with the title, you know you're into a bad thing. And the whole idea, again, was to see if I could do it in 10 minutes and do it well. And it took 75 minutes because they argued with every line on every chart. And at the end, what happened was the following. The fellow right next to the Secretary of Defense said, Mr. Secretary, the thing that bothers me is that that last chart is a conclusion chart, and it's the conclusion of a colonel. And we're talking about briefing the president this afternoon on something that's very controversial, and it will cause, you know, perhaps billions of dollars worth of changes if the president wants to do something about it. And I don't think that conclusion of this colonel should be in this chart. Take that conclusion chart out. And the next guy said yes, and there's really no point in bothering the president with a briefing that reaches no conclusion. And they all agreed. And they, you know, said things like this for maybe 5 minutes. And finally, the Secretary of Defense, now here I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact words, they're in the book, but said something like, Colonel, is what you meant to say on that last chart the following, that unless we get off the dime, we, the United States, get off the dime and do something very smart, very quickly, the Soviets are going to dominate the world. And I thought, I've been set up before, and here, this is the Secretary of Defense and all these other people, you know, and I'd like to make a promotion in the military. And I know nobody in the Pentagon says anything straightforward like that, so he must not agree with that. And I thought, but I'm going to tell him anyway. And I said, yes, sir, that's exactly what I wanted to put on the chart, but didn't. Because I didn't think it would ever get to you if I put it on there. And he said, well, put that on a chart when you show it to the president this afternoon.
Now, I have to tell you that Tom is a fellow that recognizes a picture of Archangel Michael when he sees him. Because he just did.